All right, so the DBQ this week was all about the Industrial Revolution, essentially. It was asking you more or less to explain what major changes affected the world. And this is one of the broader prompts that you'll ever get. I think that this actually was a good representation of kind of where the actual AP test might be coming from. It's a topic that we can look at and kind of say, okay, well, this applies to a bunch of different things. It applies to a bunch of different places. And if you noticed, even though the Industrial Revolution is set and based upon essentially England is where the first major, revolution occurs, none of these documents are even remotely close to any sort of English thing. So it's made to kind of challenge the traditional way in which you kind of look at this, say, okay, well, I know this is all about the Industrial Revolution, but none of it is on the place that we really looked at whenever it started, right? So when you were analyzing this, and I didn't make a key like the last time, essentially, because I really wanted to go through this and actually show you that there's so many different ways that you could have taken with this one. That writing them down, in all honesty, just becomes a burden of tediousness of writing down a million different things. So as we're going through, I'll kind of talk about things, talk about different ways that you could have run with them. But also, I will expand upon the fact that a prompt like this also allows people to kind of show off that outside information a lot better than the previous prompts did. Right? Because if you brought in outside evidence that connected back and related to anything from outside of these regions during the time period, that could work, right? You'll also notice that the time period that we're talking about here is we're getting closer and closer to the end of where it's essentially going to assess you on, right? So some of the documents are from 1900 even, all the way up to the end there, whereas other ones are from the earlier parts of the revolution. And so we can see factories in 1900, we can see 1875, but the most important thing to realize is that this is really the last part of the Industrial Revolution. So the nice part about the way that this prompt was kind of set up and the way that documents are is that if you talked about the origins of the Industrial Revolution, you can get the context point. If you talked about what life was like before industry took over, you can get the context point. There's a lot of different ways that you can kind of talk about background information to actually get that contextualization point that a lot of you have been missing prior to this, right? So I'm going to jump right into that and start talking about it. So the prompt is, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which people were affected by changes that occurred during the Industrial Revolution. So immediately, whenever you're looking at like the prompt, whenever you're coming up with what you're going to talk about, the Industrial Revolution is the cutoff event, right? Well, the Industrial Revolution doesn't really have a timeline. You can make arguments for sure that it started in the early to mid 1800s, but there's not one set date, right, that runs with this, which is better for you, right? Because if there is a concrete, this is the day that it started, then it means that whenever it comes to contextualization, you kind of have to make sure you don't hit that concrete date, right? So like in the last DBQ, if you were talking about like the maritime empires and stuff, everything before 1492 was contextualization because Columbus hadn't been here. None of the maritime empires really existed in the Americas before then. There was a date, there was a set date that marked, oh, this is when this starts. This one is a lot more fluid. There's not one day that the Industrial Revolution, quote, happens, right? There's no Declaration of Independence for this. So for your context, if you talked about the fact that most people still lived on farms before the Industrial Revolution, all of the power sources that people got had to come from water, right? So we had like mills that were essentially run by water wheels, or that the vast majority of every economy was based on buying and selling food crops and handmade goods, right? So everything was essentially made by hand. If you wanted a chair, you had to go to a master chair builder, right? Whereas after the Industrial Revolution, everything becomes industrialized and automated almost, right? So in terms of context, if you talked about the way of life, if you talked about um, the role of women in society, or even the role of the poor people in society, all of these things can be used to talk about the contextualization part. There's so many more opportunities for you in this one to get that point, right? You can actually talk about the way in which government affected this, and how we see kind of the rise of capitalism and socialism prior or not existing prior to the Industrial Revolution, and then boom, all of a sudden becoming massive things afterwards, right? So there's a lot of different things that you could talk about, and that list is very much just skimmed on by me just now. But there are so many more things that you can address in there. So for context, I'm going to kind of take it case by case here whenever I'm looking at these, just to kind of look at them and say yes or no, but really it is very broad. You can talk about a lot of things in this time period and be able to get the point. And because all of these documents are so late in the Industrial Revolution, you can actually talk about even the building of the first set of railroads are kind of occurring in other places before, in these documents. And it gives you a lot more leeway. So I think we'll see a lot more people get the context point for this one than in prior ones, right? So as long as you addressed any aspect of what life was like prior to the Industrial Revolution, and you were specific, right? So you have to also say, why or how did life change afterwards, right? So setting up that groundwork to say, people lived on farms, women were treated essentially as as housewives for everywhere, right? They didn't have jobs outside of the home. They exclusively were working inside of it, right? Or on a farm that they owned. Whereas afterwards, everything is different, right? Socialism as a concept didn't exist prior to this. You can talk about that. There's just a lot of different things, right? So it really is all encompassing here for context. I think we'll see a lot more people get a point for that, right? Next part, into your thesis statement. Your thesis, based on these documents, can address, I think there's really 3 key things that you could address. So if you talk about any set of these, I think these documents group themselves really well in terms of like how they're lined up. There's women's role in society. There is working conditions, and in general, just kind of laws and life that exist during this time period that you can talk about. There's also like the rise of socialism and or that kind of ties in with working rights, but you can also use that in talking about laws to also talk about that. Now, if you have anything other than those 3, I'm not saying that that's wrong. What I'm saying is those are, to me, the most obvious things that are occurring here. If you want to talk about living conditions, you can also talk about that, although living conditions and working conditions aren't too dissimilar, so you could probably get away with talking about both of them as in the same thing, right? So that's kind of where I'm going to be coming from whenever I'm looking at all of these documents, right? So document 1 is 2 women recalling their girlhoods working in Japanese textile factories. So from this, we can already say that this one can apply to working conditions, and also apply to women's role in society. The fact that women were actually going to work, and also that they were contributing, right, to a household. So I'm going to read it, and I'm going to actually break down and discuss each document as I go, rather than just kind of list it off. So for morning while it was still dark, we worked in the lamplit factory till 10 at night. After work, we hardly had the strength to stand on our feet. When we worked later into the night, they occasionally gave us a yam. We then had to do our washing, fix our hair, and so on, but then it would be 11 o'clock. There was no heat even in the winter. We had to sleep huddled together to stay warm. We were not paid the first year. In the second year, my parents got 35 yen, and the following 50 yen. Soon after I went to work in the factory, my younger sister Aki came to work there too. I think she worked for about 2 years and then took to her bed because of illness. At the time, there were about 36 sick people at the factory. Those who clearly had lung troubles were sent home right away. Everyone feared tuberculosis and no one would come near such patients. Aki was sent home and died soon after. She was in her 13th year. Aki had come to the factory determined to become a 100-yen worker to make our mother happy. Could never forget her sad eyes as she left her factory, sickly and pale. So, working conditions, extremely poor. That can immediately be something that you break down for this part. Whenever we talk about, the moment you get sick, you get sent home to die, right? That's pretty tough. Women's role, the fact that, earning $50 a year, 50 yen, but it's the Japanese currency. So yeah, my fault on that one. But earning 50 yen a year, which is not all that much, right? And how the women were striving to become more and more impactful in society to the point where her sister was willing to die in order to become a 100 yen a year worker, right? So we can look at women's role in the economy there. We can look at working conditions being extremely poor. But when it comes to this document, this is one of the easier documents I think we've had so far to source, right? So sourcing this document, you can look at the woman writing it, right? The fact that when she is writing this, this is clearly her telling her personal story, right? She is telling this not to one specific person or audience, but instead she's simply recanting her actual memories. Right? She's talking about her general, experience. So her audience in this case is no one. She's not writing to anyone specifically. She's just writing, right? We don't know where this is writing to, so you can't really talk about that part. But one thing that you could address in sourcing this document is the tone and the way in which it is all spoken, right? So whenever this author is writing it, she's recanting her sister dying, right? The fact that this is an extremely personal story. She's trying to convey how dangerous this was by the fact that her sister died at 13, right? So this is almost seen as a warning. So you can talk about all of those things, how even during the time period, women knew that there were risks that were coming. And it's evident in this because they knew that it was risky to even go. And how sad it was, but how moving it is to have to watch your sister in her sad eyes as she left the factory, right? So sourcing this document, you can talk about how personal it is. You can kind of reflect on the tone in which it was written. And also just kind of realizing and referencing the fact that it's just a personal story, right? It's not meant to be a story for a newspaper or anything like that. It's a personal story. For outside evidence for this, because in all honesty, this one's a little bit tougher, but you could talk about just the rise of disease. You could talk about tuberculosis. You could talk about the black lung kind of forming in different coal mines and things like that. There's a lot of places that you could go with outside evidence for this. To point back to the fact that factories are extremely dirty and horrible places. You can also use this to explain and also discuss child labor. The fact that 13-year-old kids are dying in a factory is kind of insane. So you could talk about child labor, you could talk about that aspect, but those are all kind of places that I would go to for outside evidence for that. For document 2, so the source here is Liang Qinchao, advocate for Chinese reforms, describes in its journal, A People Made New, the need for China to renew itself to survive the industrialized West. So this is a book. It is a journal, but it is published as a book. So when it comes to sourcing this, if you want to go ahead and Google Liang and find out more about him, you can. But just in general, it is important to realize that this is a book that is meant to talk about how China needs to essentially take a China first rebuilding process to battle off the West, right? So economic competition is one of the big problems of the world today. It is the method whereby the powers attempt to conquer us. It's also the method whereby we should fight for our existence. If you're going to talk about the rise of socialism, this would be a good sentence to use for your evidence, right? So it's fighting for your existence. It's a uniting thing where the big problem, right, is economic competition. We should be banding together, right? So if you're talking about socialism, that first couple sentences, it's going to be a nice spot for you to start. The importance of improving our foreign trade has been recognized by all. So if you're going to talk about globalization as a topic, you can use it in here too. I don't know if you can really use that very well for other documents, but it definitely works for this one. So the importance, but in order to promote foreign trade, it is necessary to protect the rights of our domestic trade and industry. In order to protect these rights, it is necessary to issue a set of commercial laws. Commercial laws, however, cannot stand by themselves, and it is necessary to complement them with other laws. A law which is not carried out is tantamount to no law. It is therefore necessary to define the powers of the judiciary. When all these are carried to the logical conclusion, it will be seen that foreign trade cannot be promoted without a constitution, a parliament, and a responsible government. And just like that, we can see that whenever we look at this, it's talking about the economic and social structure along with the government connection, right? So when it comes to workers' rights and conditions, you can also talk about the fact that commercial laws need to exist in here. So you can use this document to talk about workers' rights and also working conditions because it's saying we need to set up these laws not only for like international trade, but also just for domestic things, right? So by looking at this document that way, you can use it to explain your argument in that direction. There's nothing in here for women, so good luck connecting it to document 1 in that way, but you can definitely connect it in terms of like there needs to be laws to create and protect the local and like the actual country's peoples. So you can definitely use that to talk about workers' rights and or working conditions, right? Outside evidence for here, good luck. China does not form a parliament and a constitution and a responsible government at all during this time period. We see the rise of communism happen, so that's the well after the first real industrial revolution. So it's going to be hard to tie that in. Outside evidence in this case for the document 2, it's going to be rather difficult. I think it's going to be a struggle for some people to really connect and blend the actual idea of what's happening in here with a more connected piece of evidence during the time. So document 3, we're going to move on. And I realized I should probably share the screen so that way you can actually look at the documents as I'm doing this. So I'll jump that over here. So document 3 is a photograph showing the construction of the western portion of the Amur line of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So the Trans-Siberian Railroad connected essentially the eastern half of Russia to the western half. And it says in the document at the top, it says Russia's transcontinental line was intended to supply and populate Siberia, as well as deliver raw materials to the rapidly developing industries of the Urals, right? So when you use this document, one of the things that you can point out is working conditions, the fact that they are literally building a railroad in Siberia, out in like the frigid conditions, and they all have coats and stuff, but it doesn't look like there's very many of them, and there's definitely not a pleasant place to sit and relax there, right? So you can talk about working conditions. You can also talk about industrialization on a whole and the fact that they were looking to populate the more rural areas to try to send people out there, but also so that way they could send more raw materials back for their industries, right? So whenever you look at kind of how that connects back to your argument, you can say, because of industrialization, there is this push, to essentially take raw materials from one place, bring it to another. But then the whole purpose for that is for industry to really start taking off, right? The easiest and most direct connection here is going to be to working conditions, because you can kind of look at that and realize they have to blow a hole through a mountain. So not exactly fun or easy. Outside evidence for this part would actually be really easy. You can point back to the formation or creation of railroads in anywhere else in the world. You can talk about how this was a universal thing that happened in every industrialized place. You can talk about the United States getting their transcontinental railroad, or England building their sets of railroads that cross over, and the fact that there's 600 more times feet of railroad than there are coastline in England, right? So you can kind of use a whole bunch of different outside pieces that tie back to anything related to the railroad. You can talk about the creation of the steam engine. You can talk about the formation of like major trusts and like railroad companies that would go on to dominate all of like the industry and form massive monopolies. Or there's a whole bunch of different ways that you could run with this. But basically any outside evidence piece tied back to building a railroad, that'll work, right? In terms of sourcing the document, that's tough. I find it difficult for me to even source pictures, so I think it's going to be very difficult for some of you guys to also source this. But when you're looking at the document, it is important to note they are definitely staged. This may have been like a piece of propaganda, but we don't really know that. All we know is that all of these workers basically stopped, took a picture, and that's it. We don't know who this was for, what this was sent out off to, how the government was using it, but it kind of makes it tough to source. Document 4 is extremely small, but tells you a lot. So first off, it is a Buddhist priest from a rural area of Japan, for which many farm girls were sent to work in the mills circa 1900. So when it says Buddhist priest, it doesn't mean that he's a Christian. He is just a Buddhist. He's a priest because he's someone who is actually leading the monastery, right? So don't try to dive into that and say that somehow there's a blending of the religions. There's not. So don't try to go that route with it. We don't really know much about who the Buddhist priest is, but we do know that based on the tone, the way that he's talking, essentially is to try and talk about how farm life is falling apart and why that needs to change, right? So the money that a factory girl earned was often more than a farmer's income for the entire year. For these rural families, the girls were an invaluable source of income. The poor peasants during this period had to turn over 60% of their crops to the landlord. The peasants' only salvation was the girls who went to work in the factories. This ties directly back to document 1, right? So when it comes to women going to the workplace, it shows that, a girl, a child could make more in a factory than a farmer could farming their entire land, right? This is a massive change. This is a massive shift in the way in which society is structured. It's why we see people moving into cities and leaving the farms, right? It shows that women have a place in society and are going to work. It also ties back to the idea at the beginning, if you remember, with childhood labor, and I said you try to kind of make that an argument in there too. The fact that the only way in which Japanese families were able to survive was because they sent their girls to work in the factories, right? So this also can work into, if you're talking about social changes that needed to happen with the welfare state, the fact that 60% of their crops got sent to the landlord. They didn't get to keep them. The government basically took them, right? So there's a lot of things that you can use for this. In terms of outside evidence, if you talked about, housing rates or the growth of cities during this time period, or the industrialization of Japan in general, then you could work it in to here. Again, if you brought in another outside evidence piece about child labor, that could also work for this part. Document 5, you could source this document to an extreme. There is so much information out there about the GOTHA program. It is still ongoing today. It is a constant thing. It was a family essentially that set up. It was an extremely wealthy German family that basically set up a housing project that is extremely affordable and cheap to live in. There's a bunch of information out there about it. You could talk about it. You could pull it out. You could literally like go for it and look at it and add any sort of information about that for sourcing. Anytime it is a major thing like this, you can pull information from the internet. I would if I were in your shoes. So that's kind of how I would approach it. But essentially, it was a program meant to provide high-paying jobs and low-cost living. That's a pretty solid thing. They had houses. It was essentially an apartment complex that were extremely cheap to live in. They were extremely well made. And in order to live there, all you had to do was keep a job. So they were looking to provide better jobs and cheaper housing for all of the masses of regular people. So sourcing this, you can talk about that. You can talk about the motivations behind it, why they were, that's why they were writing the way that they were. They were trying to convince the government and more people to join into their program. Right? So it says, in addition to the demand for universal suffrage for all above 20 years of age, secret ballots and freedom of the press, free and compulsory education, that is a whole bunch of things right out the gate that is in a bracket that is said, but not necessarily in this part. All of those things are essential things that come with a democracy, but also within a socialism, right? So this program is going to be about socialism rising, so we can tie in that way in your argument right there. When it says the Socialist Labor Party of Germany demands the following reforms in the present social organization: the extension of political rights and freedom, a single progressive income tax, unlimited right of association, a normal working day, prohibition of child labor and all forms of labor by women which are dangerous to health or morality, laws for the protection of the life and health of the workmen, inspection by officials, effective systems of enforcement, regulation of prison labor. This document should have been used by all of you because it ties into just about any argument you can make. It literally says in here, when it comes to working conditions, right? That's in there 2 or 3 different ways. Child labor is in here. Women's role in the factory is addressed in here. This document is literally the wildcard document that you could use for any argument. So I hope that you did. For outside evidence in this, if you wanted to talk about the rise of socialism, this would be a good place to talk about Marx and kind of the idea of like socialism rising in Germany during the time period. That could definitely work. Or again, any outside evidence piece about working conditions, diseases that are spreading, child labor, any of those things could work for this part. This document is hands down the easiest document that you've gotten to work with by far so far, right? So that's kind of where everything goes when it comes to like this DBQ. I think this DBQ lended itself more open in terms of which type of essay to write. So a lot of things that people brought up whenever we had our one-on-one meetings was, how do I know which type of DBQ to write? Should I write a comparison? Should I write a causation, or should I write a continuity and change? This one could be any of them. You could compare different areas from one to another. You could compare the way in which Japan had its industrialization to the way in which other regions did. And you could just say Europe and use like the Russian one and or the German one. You could really, in my opinion, the easiest one to write here would be a causation and talk about how all of these things caused major impacts, right? So women going to work caused massive, effects on the economy. But in all honesty, you could write all 3 types of essay for this, and it would be perfectly fine. This is probably a better representation of a prompt in which the actual AP test is going to be on. It'll be something like this where you can argue any of the types of essays as long as you can pull the information and build them into an argument. All right. So with that being said, I am going to stop the recording at this point and take questions. If you have not had your conference with me yet, I look forward to talking to you. I've had one with, I want to say, almost 30 people so far. So please don't be afraid of it. Hopefully it's a moment for you to kind of talk and get some clarity on things. So I'm going to end the recording. And if you have individual questions, please don't hesitate. Reach out to me, ask me, whatever it might be. And I'm going to put up the rubric, just scoring thing, a poll question like you've had before. So simply rate and see how you think you did on this one compared to the others.